By morning, the paperwork would call it an unauthorized modification. By morning, the road behind the crossroads would still exist. The field hospital would still be there. The fuel trucks would still have a route. The infantry companies trying to stitch a line together in the Ardennes would still have time. Thin, bloody time, but time. None of that had been on the form. On the form, the tank had been dead. The Ardennes in December didn't feel like a place built for machines. The cold made metal contract and seals stiffen until everything that should have moved did so reluctantly, and everything that should have started demanded bribery, heat, patience, violence. Snow packed into linkages, froze into corners, and turned small tolerances into hard problems. Diesel thickened, battery cells slowed down, hydraulic fluid moved like syrup. Even the sound of an engine seemed smaller in that kind of cold, as if the air refused to carry it far. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney had been awake for so long that his own hands looked foreign to him when he pulled off his gloves. He watched them work anyway. That was the only thing that kept panic away. Tasks with edges, bolts with threads, a sequence that did not care what the Germans were planning. He worked under a canvas lean-to beside a farmhouse that had been repurposed into an ordnance maintenance point. The building smelled of wet hay and wood smoke and the sour bite of gasoline. Tools lay on crates, on frozen ground, on whatever flat surface existed. Somebody had painted a crude white star on the barn door, then half scrubbed it off when they realized the mark could draw attention from the air. Now it looked like a ghost. Outside, the world was gray. A low ceiling of cloud pressed down on the forest, and the light never really arrived, only shifted from night to dull morning. The trees beyond the farm were black and rigid, branches held still by ice. Somewhere in that forest, engines moved with purpose. Delaney had been an automobile plant mechanic in Michigan before the Army taught him to be an ordnance man. Not a designer, not an engineer in the fancy sense. A man who kept production running when the line wanted to break down, who knew how to coax stubborn machinery with crude tools and small miracles. The Army had taken that skill and welded it to a new environment: mud, shrapnel, haste, and the constant fact that a broken vehicle was not just property, it was a gap. That morning, the gap had a name painted on its flank in white: Lucky 13. The Sherman sat half in the mud, half on planking, its tracks dusted with snow, its side armor scarred with old hits and new dents. It looked less like a weapon and more like a thing that had been dragged through winter and told to be grateful. Its engine deck was open, panels propped like broken ribs. The smell coming from it was wrong, sweet, burnt, metallic, the smell of oil that had been cooked too long. The crew that had brought it in had not walked in with a story. They had walked in with the kind of silence that told Delaney everything he needed to know. A tank that came back under its own power still had hope. A tank that came back towed behind another vehicle came back because someone had decided it was worth the trouble. The driver, a kid with cheeks raw from wind, had pointed at the rear and said a few flat words. Final drive started screaming. Then it locked. We couldn't move. That was all. No drama. No speeches. They had been trying not to freeze. Delaney had crawled beneath the Sherman with a flashlight and a wrench and felt the truth in the metal. The left final drive housing was warm in a way it shouldn't have been in this weather. Warm meant friction. Friction meant failure. The oil that should have been inside had leaked out through a compromised seal, and now there was residue, dark and gritty, frozen along the casing. A Sherman's final drive was both robust and fragile. It could take a surprising amount of abuse until it couldn't. The way the vehicle transferred power to its tracks was the kind of engineering that demanded lubrication, alignment, proper clearances. War rarely offered proper anything. Delaney had looked up at the gray sky, listened to distant artillery, and felt the weight of time. There were rules for this. There were manuals. There were procedures that said a tank with a final drive failure needed a proper rebuild, a replacement unit, the kind of work done in a rear depot where there were hoists and heated shops and coffee that didn't taste like gasoline. The Ardennes didn't have rear depots today. Today it had frozen roads and confused orders and men trying to hold villages with thin lines of infantry. Today it had a rumor spreading through the farm, quiet but urgent, that German armor had punched through somewhere east and units were shifting fast. The words counterattack were being said without anyone wanting to own them. Delaney didn't need a map to understand what that meant. He had heard the engines at night, deeper than trucks. He had seen the ambulances moving the wrong direction. By mid-morning, a lieutenant from the Armored Battalion's S3 section arrived in a jeep, face tight, collar turned up. He climbed out and spoke in quick, clipped phrases to the maintenance officer, a captain with tired eyes. They stood near the barn and talked while Delaney kept working, pretending not to listen, because that was how enlisted men survived. The lieutenant's voice carried anyway. "Road junction near the river. Infantry's pulling back. We've got nothing heavy on that approach. If we lose the junction, the supply line behind it gets cut. We're already blind on radio in the woods." The captain asked for time. The lieutenant shook his head. "We don't have time." Then the lieutenant glanced at the Sherman and asked a question like it was a sin. "Can you get that thing moving?" The captain didn't answer right away. He looked at Delaney, and Delaney felt a strange, cold focus settle over him. The captain didn't need to say anything. This wasn't about capability in a clean sense. It was about what could be forced into existence under pressure. Delaney climbed out from under the tank and wiped his hands on a rag that had once been white. "It's not a quick fix. It's a drive unit problem." "How long?" the lieutenant asked. Delaney didn't like guessing. Guessing got people killed. But the question wasn't really asking for honesty. It was asking for an offer. "Hours, if it was real," Delaney said. "Less if you accept consequences." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. The captain's mouth tightened. The captain spoke like a man balancing two disasters. "What kind of consequences, Sergeant?" Delaney looked at the final drive housing again. In his mind, he saw a clean shop and proper parts. Then he saw the road junction and German armor moving through it. In war, consequences were rarely optional. They were just differently shaped. "If I open it up, there's no time for a full rebuild," Delaney said. "But I might be able to get it to run for a while, long enough to move, long enough to fight. It'll be wrong." The lieutenant didn't need more detail. "Do it," he said. The captain hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded once, as if signing something without paper. Delaney went back to the tank. He found his assistant, Corporal Owens, a skinny man with cracked knuckles, and told him to fetch what they had: a spare final drive seal kit, a half-empty can of gear oil, a hand pump, a torch, and the one thing Delaney hated using in cold weather: wire. There were ways to do this properly, and there were ways to do it in a field where the ground was frozen and the Germans were moving. Delaney chose the field. He pulled the final drive access cover, and the smell hit him like an insult. Burnt oil, metal dust, the sharp tang of overheated deer teeth. Inside, it wasn't a clean failure, it was partial destruction. The bearing surfaces were scored, the gear teeth showed chips, the housing had fragments embedded in grease like shrapnel. A proper mechanic would have declared it scrap. Delaney stared at it, jaw tight. He wasn't a man who believed in miracles, but he believed in margins. He believed in the fact that machines often died slowly if you managed their pain. He took a screwdriver and scraped a paste of metal and oil from the bottom of the housing. It glittered faintly. That glitter was time slipping away. He could not replace the entire drive unit. He didn't have another one. The closest spare was likely on a truck somewhere, stuck behind an overturned trailer, or back in a depot that might as well have been another country. So he did what frontline mechanics did. He cannibalized the living and the dead. Behind the barn sat a knocked-out Sherman, blackened, its turret still turned toward wherever it had last fired. It had been dragged in weeks ago and stripped of obvious parts. Nobody liked walking near it. It smelled like old fire. Delaney walked to it anyway because it had something his tank needed. Final drive assemblies were not interchangeable between every variant, but the seals and some components could be adapted if you were willing to be impolite to the manual. He opened the dead tank's housing with numb fingers, pried parts loose, and felt the cold bite into his wrists. The metal was so cold it burned. He pulled a bearing that wasn't perfect, but was better than what he had. He pulled a seal that hadn't been cooked. He carried them like stolen food. When he returned, Owens looked at the parts and swallowed. It's not, Delaney agreed. Owens didn't argue. Men argued when they believed they had time. Here they only asked one question with their eyes. Will it work long enough? Delaney's plan was not to rebuild. It was to relieve pressure, reduce friction, and keep the gears from eating themselves immediately. He cleaned the housing as best he could, wiping out the worst of the metal slurry, packing the remaining space with grease and whatever gear oil they had. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. He needed more lubrication and a way to keep it from leaking out the second the tank moved. The seal surface was compromised. The manual would have called for machining. Delaney had no lathe. He had a file, sandpaper, and stubbornness. He filed the surface until his hands shook, using the file as if it was a weapon. He smoothed it with sandpaper until it felt less like a battlefield and more like a chance. He heated the area slightly with the torch, not too much, just enough to make the metal expand and accept the seal more tightly. Cold metal was unforgiving. Warm metal gave you tolerances you could borrow. Owens held a lantern close, the flame sheltered by his hand. The light flickered. Shadows danced on the Sherman's armor like ghosts. At one point, the maintenance officer came out, watched them work, and left without speaking. His silence wasn't judgment, it was recognition that the work was beyond what anyone could officially approve. Delaney seated the seal and tapped it in with a mallet, each strike measured. Too hard, and it would deform. Too soft, and it would not sit. He had done it in shops where it was just work. Now it felt like surgery performed with a hammer. Then he did the truly forbidden part. He took wire and wrapped it around the seal housing, anchoring it to a nearby bolt head, creating a crude retention. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't something you'd photograph, but it would help keep the seal from walking out under vibration. Wire was the kind of solution that existed only in war. Ugly, effective, and impossible to explain to a man behind a desk. Owens watched him do it and said quietly, "They'll hang you for that." Delaney didn't look up. "They'll hang us all if the road opens." He repacked the housing again, poured in oil, and closed it. Then came the question that mattered. Would it turn? They jacked the left rear slightly and had Mallory, Lucky 13's driver, climb back into the tank to try moving the steering levers gently. Mallory looked exhausted. His eyes had the flat focus of a man who had watched a machine fail at the wrong moment and had carried it personally. Delaney banged on the hull. "Easy," he called. "Don't force it." Mallory nodded, hands on levers, and moved them slightly. The track twitched. The sound was wrong, grinding, faint, like teeth on bone. Delaney held his breath. Mallory tried again, even gentler. This time the track moved a fraction more. The grinding softened. The final drive didn't lock. Delaney exhaled slowly. Owens said nothing, but his shoulders loosened a little. The lieutenant from S3 returned as if summoned by the sound of possibility. "Is it moving?" Delaney looked at him, face streaked with grime. "It's moving," he said, "for now."
"How long?" the lieutenant asked again, because that was the only language staff understood. Delaney chose his words carefully. "Long enough to get to the junction, maybe long enough to hold it, not long enough to pretend this is fixed." The lieutenant nodded as if any time was acceptable time. Then Delaney added something the lieutenant did not want to hear. "If you wanted to do more than crawl, I need to change something else." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "What?" Delaney wiped his hands again and looked at the tank's engine bay. The Sherman's Ford GAA V8 was dependable, but in this cold, under load, trying to move a compromised final drive, it would strain. Strain meant heat. Heat meant oil thinning. Oil thinning meant more wear. More wear meant the final drive would die. He needed the tank to move with control, not brute force, but he also needed it to have a burst of power if the crew had to reposition quickly under fire.
The manual had settings for governors and throttle response that kept engines within safe parameters. Those parameters were for longevity and training and liability. This was not a day for longevity. Delaney opened the governor linkage and adjusted it subtly, increasing the allowable RPM for short bursts. Not a dramatic change, not enough to turn a Sherman into a racer, but enough to give the driver a little more response when he needed it. It was the equivalent of telling the engine to tolerate a certain amount of abuse for a brief window. It was, in every official sense, wrong. It was also the kind of wrong that could keep men alive for an hour. Owens watched him and shook his head slightly. "That's gonna cook it." Delaney's answer was dry. "Everything cooks eventually." The tank crew came back. The commander, Sergeant Mercer, climbed onto the hull and listened as Delaney explained what he'd done and what it meant. Mercer didn't look like a hero. He looked like a tired man with a face weathered by wind and smoke, a man who understood that machines and men both had limits, and that today those limits would be tested. Mercer asked one question: "Will it throw the drive?" Delaney didn't lie. "It might," he said, "but it might not if you keep it smooth, if you don't crank it hard in one place, if you don't pretend you've got new parts." Mercer nodded. He understood. There was no gratitude in his expression, only acceptance that this was the deal. And then the tank rolled out. It left the farmyard at a cautious pace, tracks crunching snow, engines sounding slightly different, more responsive, a little sharper. Delaney watched it go and felt a strange emptiness. He had spent hours forcing a machine back into motion, and now that motion belonged to men who would take it into the forest. Behind the tank, infantry moved too, small shapes with rifles and breath clouds, hunched under weight. Trucks crawled past, loaded with ammunition and medical supplies, drivers staring forward with the same grim focus everyone had. The day had shifted. The air itself felt heavier, as if the forest had decided to become a battlefield. Delaney didn't go with the tank. Mechanics were not supposed to go. But he did what mechanics always did when they knew their work was unfinished. He followed the sound. He climbed into a jeep with Owens and a driver, and they moved behind the infantry, keeping distance, moving slowly through the narrow roads. The forest closed around them. Snow fell in thin, steady lines. As they approached the junction near the river, more a bend and a bridge than a dramatic crossing, they saw the first signs of collapse. An American half-track sat abandoned in the ditch, its rear wheel torn, its door open. A wounded man lay wrapped in a blanket near a tree, face pale, staring upward without expression. A rifle leaned against a stump like a forgotten tool. A few soldiers moved backward along the road, not running but not standing still, the disciplined retreat of men who had seen something they didn't want to see again. The bridge itself was small, stone sides, a narrow span over a creek that ran dark under ice. The road approached it through a shallow cut in the trees. It was exactly the kind of place where vehicles had to slow and line up, exactly the kind of place a push could be delayed if the first few vehicles were stopped. Lucky 13 sat just short of the bridge, hull angled slightly, gun covering the road coming out of the forest. It looked like it belonged there, but Delaney knew it did not belong anywhere in this condition. Mercer's crew was inside, buttoned up. The turret moved slowly as the gunner adjusted. The engine idled, steady but strained. Nearby, infantry dug in with numb hands, scraping at frozen soil with entrenching tools that sounded like they were chipping stone. An officer waved men into positions, his voice tight. A bazooka team crouched behind a fallen tree, rockets lying in the snow like dull spears. Delaney climbed out of the jeep and walked toward the tank, keeping low. He could hear distant engines, heavier now, unmistakable. He could feel the vibration through the ground. German armor. He reached the tank's rear and slapped the hull twice, a signal. The loader cracked the hatch slightly, eyes scanning. Mercer's face appeared briefly, pale in the cold air. Delaney spoke quickly, not because he wanted to talk, but because the machine needed words attached to it. "Keep the left turns gentle," he said. "Don't fight the levers. If it starts to scream, back off. If you smell oil burning, don't ignore it." Mercer's eyes held Delaney for a second. Then he nodded and shut the hatch. Delaney stepped back into the ditch line and crouched beside Owens. They waited. The first German vehicles appeared not as tanks, but as shadowed shapes, half-tracks, infantry, the forward edge of something heavier behind. The forest ahead was thick, but the road forced everything into a line. That was the only mercy here. Enemy mass had to become enemy sequence. Lucky 13 fired first. The 76mm gun cracked, a harsh, controlled sound that echoed weirdly in the trees. The shell hit the lead half-track and tore it open. Men spilled into the ditch, scrambling. The German column behind it compressed, brakes squealing, engines revving. Small arms fire erupted immediately, snapping and cracking. Bullets struck trees, sending splinters and bark fragments into the snow. A machine gun began hammering from the German side, its rhythm fast and angry. The Americans responded with their own fire, rifles popping, a BAR chattering from the ditch line, the bazooka team shifting, trying to find a clear angle. Then the German armor came into view. A panther's silhouette in the road was unmistakable even in poor light. Sloped armor, a long gun barrel that looked too calm, too confident. It rolled forward behind the infantry, its turret turning slowly, hunting. Delaney felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew what a Panther's gun did to a Sherman. He had seen the results. Holes punched clean through armor, crews cooked inside steel. Lucky 13 was not a new Sherman. It was patched and worn, and now held together by unauthorized decisions. The Panther paused, assessing. It fired. The shell hit the stone bridge wall and shattered it, sending rock fragments into the air like thrown blades. The blast shook the ground. Delaney felt it in his teeth. Inside Lucky 13, the crew kept firing. The Sherman's gun barked again, hitting near the Panther's track, trying to immobilize rather than penetrate. At this angle, at this distance, a clean kill was unlikely. A track hit, though, could create a jam. A jam could buy time. The Panther's turret shifted slightly, then fired again, this time toward the Sherman's hull. Delaney watched the shot strike the road just short, the impact throwing up snow and dirt. It was a miss, but it was a warning. The Sherman needed to move. Mercer tried to reposition. The tank's engine note rose. The tracks bit. The hull began to pivot slightly to gain a better angle behind a tree line. That was when Delaney heard it, the sound he had dreaded since he opened the final drive housing. A scream, not loud at first, but distinct, a high mechanical whine that did not belong in the forest. Owen's eyes widened. He glanced at Delaney as if asking permission to hope. Delaney didn't look away from the tank. His mouth tightened. Lucky 13 continued to pivot. The scream sharpened. The left track hesitated for a fraction of a second, then moved again. The governor adjustment did what Delaney had intended. The engine responded, giving a burst of torque. The tank completed its pivot and slid behind partial cover, its gun now angled toward the Panther's flank. The Sherman fired, and the shell struck the Panther's side plate near the rear. It didn't blow the tank apart, but smoke began to seep from the engine deck. The Panther slowed. Its commander ducked. The vehicle's forward momentum stalled. Not a kill, a disruption. The German infantry around the Panther faltered, suddenly less eager to move into the open when their steel support was no longer confidently advancing. They dropped into ditches, firing from cover rather than pushing. The American infantry used that pause to reposition, to deepen their foxholes, to shift the bazooka team into a new angle. A runner sprinted back down the road toward a rear command post, likely trying to get artillery. Time. This was what Delaney had been building with grease and wire. The Germans responded the way they always did when a push slowed. They tried to restore it with force. Another tank shape appeared behind the Panther, heavier shadow, another long barrel. The road was narrow. The vehicles were stacked now, forced to wait their turn. German officers shouted. Men tried to move damaged half-track wreckage out of the way. Under fire, every simple action became expensive. Lucky 13 fired again, high explosive this time, into the ditch line where German infantry were bunching. The blast was brutal at close range, flinging snow and bodies, forcing men down. The Sherman tried to reverse slightly to avoid becoming a fixed target. The engine note rose again. The final drive screamed louder. Delaney felt his throat go dry. He could almost see inside the housing, could almost feel the bearing grinding, the heat rising, the seal fighting to hold. Mercer was going to need that reverse. If the drive locked, the tank would become a stationary target for a Panther's gun. The bridge would become a coffin. Delaney didn't think about heroism. He thought about mechanics. He grabbed Owens and pointed toward the tank's rear, making a decision that a manual would never approve. "We get under it," he said. Owens stared at him. "Now?" Delaney didn't answer. He moved. They crawled through the ditch line, low, using the bridge wall remains and a fallen tree as cover. Bullets snapped overhead, some cracking into stone, sending dust into their faces. The cold made everything sharper, more painful. They reached the Sherman's rear, crouched beneath the engine deck. The tank's exhaust blasted hot air and soot. The smell of burning oil was faint but present. Delaney put his hand near the final drive housing and felt heat radiating through the metal. Heat in this cold was a bad sign. The tank rocked slightly as it moved. Delaney could hear the grind from inside the housing, could feel vibration through his fingertips.
He couldn't rebuild it here. He couldn't replace it. But he could do one thing that sometimes made the difference between a lock and a limp. He could flood it. He pulled a small hand pump and a can of gear oil from Owens's bag. He had brought them instinctively, the way a man carried a cigarette even after he quit. He cracked the fill plug with a wrench, fingers clumsy in gloves. Oil dribbled out. It was thin and dark, too hot, carrying glitter, metal. Delaney didn't allow himself to flinch. He jammed the pump hose into the fill opening and began forcing oil in, pumping as fast as his arms could move. Owens held the can steady, eyes wide, face streaked with soot. Above them, the Sherman fired again. The recoil shook the hull. The Germans answered with machine gun bursts. Shrapnel from a mortar round slapped the ground nearby, peppering dirt. Delaney kept pumping. The idea was simple. If he could keep a film of oil between the damaged surfaces, the gears might survive a little longer. Not forever, not even long, but long enough. He pumped until the can was empty, then he pumped air for a second, and then he pulled the hose free and tightened the plug with fingers that felt like wood. Owens stared at him as if waiting for a verdict. Delaney hit the hull twice, hard, a signal to the driver and commander that the work was done. Then he and Owens crawled back into the ditch line, breath ragged, faces numb. Lucky 13's engine note rose again as Mercer tried to reposition. This time, the scream from the final drive softened slightly, not gone, but less sharp. The tank moved. It reversed a few feet. It angled slightly. It lived. Not because the damage had disappeared, but because it had been bribed again. Delaney leaned against the ditch wall, chest heaving, and realized he was grinning. It was not joy. It was the grim satisfaction of seeing a machine respond when it should have refused. The fight continued in ugly bursts. German infantry tried to push across the road edge. They were cut down by American rifle fire and the Sherman's machine gun. German tanks fired methodically, trying to find angles, trying to hit the Sherman when it exposed itself. The bridge area filled with smoke and the smell of burnt powder and churned earth. At some point, American artillery finally began to answer. The first shells fell behind the German column, then closer, bracketing. The explosions threw up black fountains of dirt and snow. The German push slowed again, not because it lacked courage, but because it now had to survive. The delay deepened. What had been minutes became a half hour, then longer. Every minute bought meant more American units arriving in the rear, pivoting, setting roadblocks, moving anti-tank guns into position, laying mines. The Ardennes offensive was large, but its advantage depended on speed and confusion. If speed was stolen, the advantage bled away. Lucky 13 continued to move in small, careful increments, firing when it could, repositioning when it had to. Delaney watched it like a man watching a patient on a fragile machine. He looked for signs, smoke thickening, engine note changing, the sudden stop that meant the drive had finally locked. He felt the cold in his bones, but he barely noticed it now. His mind was locked on the tank. Then the moment came. The final drive scream returned, louder, harsher, and the Sherman's left track jerked. The tank tried to reverse. The track hesitated again.
Mercer, inside, must have felt it too. The Sherman stopped moving, not because it wanted to hold position, but because the machine had reached its limit. For a few seconds, the tank sat still in the open. The German Panther's turret adjusted. The shot that followed was clean. It struck the Sherman's turret near the mantlet, punching into steel with a sound that wasn't an explosion so much as an intrusion, like a giant hammer breaking a door. The impact rang across the bridge like a bell. The turret jerked. Smoke burst from a seam. For a brief moment, the Sherman did not burn. It simply sat, stunned. Then the hatch opened, and men spilled out. Mercer first, then the loader, then the driver, moving with the frantic discipline of men who knew fire could come at any second. They dropped into the ditch line, faces pale, eyes wide, breath steaming. One of them had blood on his sleeve. Delaney watched them crawl into cover and felt his jaw tighten. He didn't know if the gunner had made it out. He didn't know if the tank would catch fire. He didn't know if the Germans would surge forward now, but he knew, with a clarity that felt like a physical thing, that the tank had done what it needed to do. It had held long enough. The artillery continued to fall. The Germans, faced with the destroyed Sherman now blocking part of the approach and the bridge itself compromised by rubble, slowed their attempt to push directly across. They began shifting to alternate routes, probing the forest flanks. Their offensive would continue. This was too big to be stopped by one bridge, but the tempo here had been broken. American infantry dug deeper, more men arriving. An anti-tank gun was dragged into position by a truck, wheels slipping on ice. A machine gun team set up behind the bridge wall remnants, muzzle pointed down the road. Mines were planted with numb hands.
The junction became less of a question mark and more of a line. Delaney crawled to Mercer's crew and pressed himself into the ditch beside them. Mercer looked at him, face streaked with soot. His eyes were raw, not with tears but with smoke and fatigue. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't have to. The look was enough. The tank was gone, but the men were alive. Delaney's voice was low. "You got time," he said. Mercer nodded once. Then, after a pause, he said, "She didn't quit until she had to." Delaney didn't smile. He felt something like grief for a machine, which was absurd, but war made absurd things feel normal. That tank had been an extension of men's will, and it had been pushed beyond any manual's promise. Owens was beside Delaney, shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline. "They'll ask what happened," he murmured. Delaney stared at the ruined Sherman, smoke curling from its seams, snow melting in small patches around it from residual heat. He already knew how it would be written. Somewhere behind the line, an officer would fill out a report. It would have boxes for equipment lost, for cause, for corrective action. It would not have a box for "held the line long enough." The Germans eventually pulled back from the direct approach, seeking easier routes. The forest swallowed their movement again, but the road remained contested, and the Americans held. By late afternoon, the battle had shifted elsewhere. Other roads, other junctions, other desperate holds. The Ardennes was a patchwork of crises, and each one demanded a story to explain it. Most stories were simplified into something staff could understand.
Lucky 13's story would not be told with romance. It would be told with numbers. Delaney and Owens returned to the farmhouse maintenance point at dusk, moving like men who had been hollowed out. The barn still smelled of hay and oil. The tools were still laid out. There were more vehicles now, more wounded metal rolling in, half-tracks with shattered wheels, trucks with blown radiators, a Stuart tank with its tracks twisted like ribbon. War did not pause because a story ended. War simply shifted its workload. That night, Delaney sat near a stove that barely warmed the air. He cleaned his hands with gasoline and a rag. The smell clung to him. His fingers were cracked and red. He couldn't stop them from shaking now that the urgency had passed. The captain came in, face lined. He carried a clipboard with forms that looked too clean for the day they had lived through. He sat down without preamble. "I got a message from battalion," he said. Delaney didn't look up. "About the tank." The captain nodded. "They want a cause statement. They want to know why the final drive failed. They want to know if maintenance procedures were followed." Delaney stared at the floor for a moment. He pictured the housing full of metal glitter. He pictured his wire retention. He pictured the governor adjustment, the exact angle of the screw he'd turned, the way the engine note had sharpened. He could lie cleanly and say mechanical failure due to combat wear. He could avoid mentioning the improvisations. He could avoid the word unauthorized. But Delaney had never been good at clean lies. Mechanics lived in reality, and reality left marks. He spoke quietly. Final drive was already failing. No time for depot-level repair. I cannibalized parts and retained the seal. Adjusted governor for short bursts. Flooded the housing under fire. The captain's eyes tightened. "You understand what you just said?" Delaney nodded once. "Yes, sir." The captain exhaled slowly, a man trying to decide whether to protect his sergeant or protect his career. He wasn't a coward. He was simply a cog in a machine of paperwork and blame. "Do you know how that reads?" the captain asked. Delaney's voice stayed even. "It reads like I broke rules." "It reads like you endangered a crew," the captain said. Delaney finally looked up, eyes hard.
The crew was going to be endangered either way. Without that tank, the junction opens. With the junction open, the whole rear line's endangered. The captain didn't argue the logic. He couldn't. He had been there. He had heard the engines. He had seen the infantry retreating. He knew what was at stake. But knowledge didn't always translate into forgiveness on paper. The captain tapped the clipboard. They're going to file it as unauthorized field modification. They'll say it contributed to loss of vehicle. Delaney felt something cold and bitter rise in his chest, not fear, but anger at the neatness of it. The vehicle had been lost because German armor hit it. It had been lost because a tank held a bridge longer than any manual would have predicted. It had been lost because the war did not care about safe parameters. He didn't say any of that out loud. Anger wasted heat. He said only, "Did we hold it?" The captain looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We held it long enough. The engineers got mines down. Anti-tank guns came up. The column didn't break through there."
Delaney let that sink in. He felt the exhaustion settle heavier. The truth was simple and brutal. The tank's sacrifice had worked. The captain rubbed his eyes. "They're not going to write it that way." Delaney almost laughed, but it came out as a dry breath. "They never do." The captain leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not going to crucify you on the report. I'm going to write field expedient repair to restore mobility under emergency conditions. I'm going to omit details that don't help." Delaney didn't thank him. Gratitude was a luxury. He simply nodded once, recognizing the gesture for what it was, a small protection in a system that preferred clean blame. Outside, the night deepened. The forest still held engines. The war still moved. Over the next week, Delaney saw more tanks come back with worse damage. He saw men sleeping in ditches because there were no tents. He saw medics working in barns with straw on the floor, turning farmhouses into hospitals. He saw officers with maps that meant less each day. Lucky 13 became a rumor, the tank that held the bridge, then became a number. One Sherman lost, cause under review. Delaney did not return to the bridge. He didn't need to. He carried it in his hands, in the memory of pumping oil into a dying housing while bullets snapped into stone. At some point, someone from battalion headquarters asked him to explain the governor adjustment. The man was polite, clean-shaven, far too warm. He listened with the detached interest of someone collecting data. Delaney explained it in technical terms, because technical terms were safer than emotion. He talked about RPM, torque, lubrication film, seal retention. He didn't talk about the moment the tank hesitated under the Panther's gun. He didn't talk about the crew climbing out, faces white with smoke. The man wrote notes. He thanked Delaney and walked away. Days later, Delaney heard the results secondhand, an admonishment in a file, not a court-martial, not a medal, a warning about unauthorized modification, a reminder about following procedures. It felt almost comical. The war was ripping through the Ardennes, and the army was still trying to teach a mechanic manners. Delaney didn't protest. Protesting meant believing someone cared enough to listen. What mattered was the line, the road, the hinge that had held. In January, when the offensive began to stall and the weather shifted slightly, the bridge junction remained in American hands, not because one tank had saved the war, but because delays accumulated, because roadblocks mattered, because time was the currency everyone fought for. In the end, Delaney understood something that stayed with him longer than the taste of cordite or the ache in his fingers. In war, most victories were not clean. They were compromises. They were decisions made with incomplete information and executed with imperfect tools. They were held together by men doing things that would look wrong in any other context. The manuals were written for a world where time existed. The Ardennes in December 1944 did not have that world.
It had a dying Sherman, an illegal wire retention, a governor screw turned past safety, and a mechanic pumping oil under fire because he could not accept a gap opening where men would be swallowed. Lucky 13 had not been lucky in the way civilians meant it. It had not survived. It had not come back with its crew laughing. It had burned and sat crooked beside a small stone bridge, another scar in a forest full of them.
But it had done its job. It had made the Germans pay for every yard. It had made the road expensive. And in that winter, on that day, expensive was enough to keep the line from tearing open before the rest of the army could catch up. Delaney returned to his tools the next morning, hands still cracked, eyes still tired, and worked on the next broken machine, because that was how the war continued, one repair at a time, one hinge at a time, one unauthorized decision that would never fit neatly on a form.